Rome! They built roads, aqueducts, armies, monuments. They're still shaping the world today, but for all its power, some of the most fascinating parts of Roman civilization are still unresolved. Strange objects with no known purpose, like lost sacred treasures, vanished technology, missing texts, and secrets buried beneath the ruins. The empire is still leaving historians searching for answers. So, here's 15 of the most intriguing mysteries ever left behind by ancient Rome. Starting with number 15, Roman dodecahedrons. Well, I can't believe I get to say the word dodecahedron, but there it is. It's one of the strangest objects ever left behind by the Roman world. It's a small, hollow, bronze shape, now called the Roman dodecahedron. It's got 12 pentagonal faces, a circular hole in each face, and rounded knobs at every corner. The examples that survive are not crude or improvised. They were carefully made, copper-alloyed objects that would have required skill, time, and material. And yet, for all the workmanship, nobody can really say with any confidence what they were for. This is what makes them a strong Roman mystery. They're real, they're physical, and they're well made, but their purpose is still unclear. Archaeologists, though, do know a few things. Fewer than 120 examples are known, and they're concentrated in northwestern parts of the Roman world rather than in Italy itself. English Heritage notes that each one is unique, even though they all follow the same basic design. They belong to a recognized object type, but apparently that one was never standardized in a way modern researchers can decode. Some were found in Roman Britain, including complete examples from Corbridge. Others have turned up across areas that have once formed the empire's frontier zone, which really has only deepened the mystery instead of solving it. English Heritage does also point out that the archaeological contexts are mixed and frustratingly inconclusive. Dodecahedrons don't seem to belong only to forts, only to temples, graves, or only to towns. They've appeared in places that can be read in several different ways, and that makes it hard to connect them securely to any one activity or social class. If every example came from workshops, a technical explanation would look better, but the pattern is messy. This is why the objects keep slipping away from simple answers every time a scholar thinks they're getting close. Because the evidence is so thin, the theories were multiplied. English Heritage also notes that ranging from candle holders and dice to surveying instruments, range finders, glove knitting aids, scepter heads, and tools for deciding when to sow winter grain, more than 50 theories have appeared in academic discussion alone. Some proposed uses do sound clever at first, but then they break down when you compare them against the surviving examples as a group. What can be said with some confidence, though, is pretty narrow. These weren't cheap, they were intentionally designed, and they were meaningful enough to be made repeatedly over a large region, and they belong to part of the Roman world where Roman culture mixed constantly with local provincial traditions. The empire was enormous, and many objects from its frontier provinces do reflect a blend of Roman practice and regional identity. So the dodecahedrons may belong to that world, not fully foreign, not fully central, but something produced within Roman civilization that still carried local meaning modern viewers no longer understand. Number 14. The Lycurgus Cup. The Lycurgus Cup. It's one of those Roman objects that looks impressive even before you know why it matters. It's a late Roman drinking cup from the 4th century. It's now in the British Museum, and it shows the death of King Lycurgus in sculpted glass. In an ordinary description, that already kind of sounds unusual, but the real reason it keeps appearing in discussions of ancient craftsmanship is the way its color behaves. When lit from the front, it appears green. When light shines through it from behind or inside it, it turns red. That effect has fascinated viewers for centuries, and in visual terms alone, it's one of the most striking luxury objects to survive from the Roman world. The first mystery is simply how a vessel like this was made at all. The cup is not a plain beaker, it's an elaborate cage cup, meaning the outer design was cut back from the original mass of glass so that figures and decorative elements stand proud in a kind of open shell work. That already is a demanding process, and add to that the color-shifting effect and the object starts to look less like ordinary tableware and more like a demonstration piece for the highest level of Roman luxury craftsmanship. The British Museum identifies it as a late Roman glass-drinking cup with silver gilt additions, but identifying an object is easier than reconstructing a full chain of decisions and workshop knowledge that produced it. Modern analysis has solved part of the puzzle, but not all of it. Corning explains that the cup's color change comes from microscopic particles of silver and gold in the glass. Now that gives a real physical explanation for the effect, and it means the cup is not a legend or a trick of museum lighting. Did the Roman artisans know exactly what they were doing in theoretical terms, or did they just know only that a certain recipe and a process produced a cool result? Corning's summary does make it clear that people only understood the cause relatively recently, and the cup still keeps the maker's level of understanding partly out of reach. So the mystery of the Lycurgus cup is not whether it changes color, that part's established already. The mystery is how controlled the process was inside Roman production. Was this an intentional, repeatable high-end recipe known only to specialist glass workers? Was it exceptionally rare because the method was hard to control? Or was the effect discovered and preserved through practice without a full theoretical explanation? The surviving evidence does not let us answer that with any certainty. The British Museum also describes scenes from the death of Lycurgus, the king, who in myth was entangled by vines after attacking Dionysus and his followers, and that subject suits a drinking vessel, since Dionysus was tied to wine, festivity, and altered states. In other words, the object's not only technically impressive, it is conceptually well matched to its function and imagery. It's a cup that changes color depending on the light. It already feels unstable and theatrical. You pair that with a myth about punishment, intoxication, and divine power, and the whole object becomes a carefully staged luxury performance. It's not mysterious because nobody knows what it is. We know what it is. It's mysterious because it shows a level of material control that's still hard to place within the broader history of Roman glassmaking. It just goes to prove that Roman artisans could create effects far more sophisticated than people once assumed, yet it does not tell us exactly how widely that knowledge was shared. It is a rare case where the surviving object is obvious, the visual effect is undeniable, and the deeper story of manufacture is still only partly visible. You know, there is something fittingly Roman about that. The empire excelled at spectacle and controlled display. The Lycurgus cup condenses all of that into one object small enough to lift in two hands. It is luxury. It's myth and material science all locked together. And even now, with microscopes and laboratory analysis, the cup still leaves a core question open. Not what modern science can say about it, but what the Roman makers themselves truly knew when they brought that shifting red and green surface to life. Number 13. The Herculaneum Scrolls. Alright, so few Roman mysteries are as direct as this one. An entire ancient library survives, and much of it still can't be read. At Herculaneum, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried the Villa de Papyri and carbonized its book rolls instead of simply erasing them. The villa yielded a unique library of more than 1,000 papyrus scrolls along with rich decoration, sculpture, and the remains of luxurious seaside residences. Now, that already makes the site pretty awesome. The Roman civilization produced books in huge numbers, but also none of its private libraries survive in anything like this form. At Herculaneum, the books are there. The problem is that fire, pressure, and time turned many of them into blackened cylinders that are way too fragile to open safely. The story became even stranger after their rediscovery. The villa was found again in the 18th century and explored through tunnels in the 1750s and 60s, and early attempts to recover and open the papyri caused damage as well as progress. One of the first men involved in handling them sliced through the outer layers to expose the writing, and later efforts relied on painstaking mechanical systems to unroll the scrolls little by little. The entire publication process was laborious from the start, so this mystery is not just ancient, it is kind of modern. Scholars have spent centuries trying to rescue the texts that survived the volcano, only to be threatened again by methods used to reveal them. Most of the texts opened so far are Greek philosophical treatises, especially works associated with Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean philosopher, and that gives the library a recognizable intellectual profile, and it ties the villa to a Roman elite world that collected Greek learning as part of their educated life. But that's only the readable portion. The deeper mystery is in the unopened material. If hundreds of damaged rolls still exist, then a substantial body of ancient writing remains physically present, but it's intellectually inaccessible. It's not lost in the usual sense. It's not destroyed in the usual sense either. It's sealed away inside carbonized layers. There has been some recent technology that has changed the situation without really fully solving it. The Vesuvius Challenge announced in 2023 that a contestant had identified an entire word inside an unopened scroll, the first such reading in roughly 2,000 years. Then, in 2025, the Bodleian libraries reported that a virtually unrolled Herculaneum scroll revealed visible columns of texts, including roughly the last 26 lines of each column, now visible in the image. The Bodleian also noted that one of the first translated words was the Greek word for disgust. That work depended on high-energy scanning plus AI-based image processing to separate the writing from the carbonized papyrus. That was a real breakthrough, but it's not the same thing as having the full library in readable form. And that is basically where the mystery still lives. The Bodleian notes that researchers are still refining the images and hope that clearer results may eventually reach the innermost end of the scroll, where a title tag or a colophon might survive. It also reports that the Oxford Scroll appears unusual because its ink may contain a denser contaminant that shows up more clearly in scans. Some scrolls may prove easier than others, some texts remain fragmentary, and some may be physically present but only partially recoverable. The library exists there, and its contents are still emerging in uneven and uncertain ways. They may preserve texts otherwise unknown. Fuller versions of works are already attested, or details that sharpen what is known about philosophy, reading culture, and intellectual life in the Roman world. That's not a claim they're going to transform everything. The evidence is not in yet here, but it's entirely fair to say that the unread scrolls still contain answers that no one has fully recovered. Number 12. The Lost Rites of Mithras. One of the clearest mysteries inside Roman civilization is not a missing building or a broken machine. It's an entire religion whose inner life is still mostly hidden. The cult of Mithras spread widely under the Roman Empire and left behind shrines, reliefs, inscriptions, and statues. Archaeologists can identify its sacred spaces without much trouble. They can often recognize the central image immediately, but the actual beliefs, the stories, and rituals practiced by its followers are only partly recoverable. That's because Mithraism was a mystery cult, and mystery cults were designed to reveal their meaning only to the initiates. In the Roman case, that secrecy worked so well that the visual shell of the religion survived far better than its inner content. The surviving shrines are among the most visually distinctive religious spaces in the Roman world. The Met notes that Mithraic worship took place in underground chambers called Mithraea, and more than 50 of these have been found in Rome alone. Those spaces were usually narrow and arranged in a way that focused attention towards the far end, where a cult image was displayed, and in almost every case, that image showed Mithras killing a bull, a scene modern scholars called the tauroctony. It is one of the most repeated religious images of the Roman world, which makes the mystery a bit sharper rather than weaker. We have this central picture, repeated again and again, but not the full explanation that Roman initiates would have attached to it. The bull-killing image is the heart of the problem. The Met describes it in consistent terms. Mithras, wearing a cloak and a Phrygian cap, kneels on the bull and stabs it, while a dog, snake, and a scorpion appear around the scene. The image is so standardized that it clearly carried a fixed meaning inside the cult. Yet that meaning is still debated. The Met does also state that no myths about Mithras survive, so it's a remarkable gap. In many ancient religions, even when ritual details are unclear, the myths survive in poems, inscriptions, or later retellings. Here, the main image remains, but the full story behind it does not. The structure of initiation was also visible only in an outline. The Met states that Mithraism had a sequence of 7 grades of initiation, and that tells the cult was organized, hierarchical, and probably designed as a staged religious experience rather than a single act of worship. But knowing that 7 grades existed is not the same as knowing what happened at each level. We don't have a complete handbook explaining what initiates learned, what vows they made, what symbols they were shown, or how they moved from one grade to the next. The religion can be seen from the outside, almost like a building, through a locked gate, but the door to its inner practice remains mostly closed. Even the origin of the cult isn't straightforward. The Romans regarded Mithras as coming from the east, but the Met notes that earlier efforts to treat Roman Mithras simply as the same as the Zoroastrian god have been contested, and that's important because it shows that the mystery is not only about ritual, it's also about cultural formation. Mithraism was clearly part of Roman religious life, yet its deeper roots are still difficult to define precisely. Another reason the mystery persists is the nature of the written record. The cult did leave inscriptions and dedications, but it didn't leave a surviving body of explanatory texts. As archaeology noted, much of literary evidence that survives does come from outsiders, especially Christian critics. That means the religion is filtered through people who are not trying to preserve it sympathetically. And this does create a familiar Roman problem. The empire left behind enormous amounts of material, but not always the kind of material that answer the questions modern readers most want answered. That's why Mithraism does remain one of the best Roman mysteries. It's not mysterious because it's invisible, it's mysterious because it is visible in the wrong way. We can walk into reconstructed Mithraic spaces. We can look at the god, the bull, the torchbearers, the animals, the stars, and the cave-like setting, and we can map where the shrines stood in Roman cities. But the central experience of the religion, what the initiation felt like, and what the faithful believed they were entering, still resists our complete reconstruction. In a civilization that was famous for leaving roads, amphitheaters, aqueducts, laws, and inscriptions across 3 continents, the cult of Mithras remains a reminder that secrecy can survive even after the walls have fallen. Number 11. Nero's rotating dining room. Ancient writers claimed that Emperor Nero had a dining room that rotated day and night like the heavens. For a long time, that sounded like the kind of story people tell about emperors when they want to make them seem theatrical and slightly unreal. Nero attracted exactly that kind of storytelling in antiquity, but in this case, archaeology has made the old claims harder to dismiss. What survives today is not a fully preserved room that can simply be visited and understood at a glance. Instead, what has been found is a large circular structure on the Palatine that may support the system for the most famous rotating dining room described by Suetonius. That's what makes it a strong Roman mystery. The literary description exists, the archaeological remains exist, and the connection between them is plausible, but it's not beyond debate. The ancient text at the center of the mystery is brief, but it is unforgettable. Suetonius wrote that Nero's principal dining room was round and revolved continuously day and night, in imitation of the cosmos. Now that single line is one of the reasons this story has survived so powerfully. It turns architecture into a performance. A banquet becomes a moving image of the universe, with the emperor at the center. The question for modern archaeology, though, has never been whether Romans could build impressive dining spaces. They clearly could. The question has been whether this specific rotating hall was real in a literal mechanical sense. In 2009, archaeologists working on the Palatine unveiled a circular brick structure with a central pillar more than 4 meters in diameter. Associated Press reported that the excavators believe the remains belong to the banquet hall of Nero's Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. This site was only partially excavated, but the foundations, the great central support, and the traces of the underlying mechanism were enough to convince the excavation team that they were dealing with something unusual. Lead archaeologist François Villedieu said that the structure could not be compared to anything else known in ancient Roman architecture, and that's exactly the kind of phrase historians treat with caution, but it does capture the point. The remains don't look ordinary. The CNRS later did summarize the case a bit more carefully. Its account says that the Franco-Italian team discovered remains of a mechanism that could have allowed the rotation of the floor of the main dining room. Now that wording is important. Could have allowed is not the same thing as absolute proof. It does place the discovery in the right area, strong archaeological support, but still interpretation rather than uncertainty. The structure does appear to match the ancient description surprisingly well, yet the archaeologists are still reconstructing exactly how the mechanism would have worked and how much of the dining space itself actually moved. The archaeological remains do seem to point towards an engineered rotating platform, perhaps driven by water and maybe supported by a substructure, but the room no longer stands complete, and the luxury fittings that would have made the whole space instantly understandable are long gone. We're just left with the bones of the machine, not the finished spectacle. The marble, the movement, the lighting effects, the dining furniture that would have made the room feel like an imperial cosmic theater are mostly matters of reconstruction. Scholarly caution, though, remains important. A 2023 review noted that Vigna Barberini's structure had been interpreted as the famous Sanatio Rotunda described by Suetonius. Now, that wording does signal that the identification, though influential, is still an interpretation rather than a closed case. In other words, the room is not mysterious because there's no evidence. It's mysterious because the evidence is impressive, but it's incomplete. The excavation does strongly suggest that the literary tradition was grounded in something real, yet it doesn't let us walk straight from surviving brickwork to a final and total understanding of this original building. Number 10. The Shattered Marble Map of Rome. At one point, Roman civilization created a giant marble map of its own capital and mounted it on a wall. It wasn't a sketch, it wasn't a symbolic image, it's not a traveler's guide. It was an enormous carved plan of the city, detailed enough to show not only major monuments, but also rooms, shops, staircases, and even interior arrangements. Today, that object is known as the Forma Urbis Romae, or Severan Marble Plan, and it's one of the most extraordinary urban documents ever made in antiquity. It's also one of Rome's greatest unfinished puzzles, because most of it is gone, only fragments survive, and scholars have spent centuries trying to fit them back together. Stanford's digital Forma Urbis Romae project describes the map as measuring about 18.1 by 13 meters and dating between AD 203 and 211. It originally covered an entire wall inside the Templum Pacis, and what makes it so astonishing is the level of detail here. Stanford notes that it depicted the ground plan of every architectural feature of the ancient city, from major public monuments to small rooms and staircases. The map was not just large, it was dense with information. In modern terms, it was something like a monumental stone database of Rome. And yet, one of the first mysteries appears immediately. There's no ancient references to the map in any surviving literary source, and that means it had to be dated and understood mainly through the archaeology and the object itself, not really through a clear explanation of why it was made. In later history is where the puzzle begins. Stanford states that only about 10 to 15% of it survives, broken into 1,186 pieces. Starting in late antiquity, these slabs were stripped from the wall, reused in other buildings, or burned in lime kilns. Even after the map was rediscovered in the 16th century, fragments continued to be moved, broken, reused, and even lost. This means the mystery wasn't simply that the map is damaged, it's that one of the most detailed records of ancient Rome was turned over centuries into an enormous jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. What survives, though, is enough to reveal the scale of the project, but not enough to restore the city in full. The surviving portion, though, is still incredibly valuable. The map can preserve layouts of buildings that have otherwise changed or vanished, and it does provide evidence for the structure of imperial Rome at a level of precision that written sources rarely offer. This is why Stanford calls it a key resource for the study of ancient Rome, but that usefulness does also feed the mystery. Every fragment matters, and a piece showing part of a portico, a curved wall, or a row of tiny rooms can change how scholars identify a neighborhood or understand a monument. The purpose of the map is not fully settled. Rome's own museum description says it probably had a propaganda function, which celebrated the power of the city and its monuments, and that makes sense. A marble image of the capital on that scale would have been a statement about control and imperial reach. But probably is the key word here, because ancient literary references are missing. The exact official purpose of the map is still inferred, rather than directly stated by any Roman authors. Was it mainly decorative, administrative, ideological, ceremonial, or some combination of all four? The surviving evidence points towards authority, but it does not reduce the map to a single certain function. Number 9. The Lost Sibylline Books. Few mysteries in Roman civilization are as important and as frustrating as the Sibylline books. Unlike many Roman puzzles, this one's not about whether the object existed. Ancient sources are clear that Rome possessed a set of prophetic books that were treated as one of the state's most guarded resources. According to Roman tradition, the books were associated with the Sibyl of Cumae and were ultimately kept in the Capitoline to be consulted in emergencies. What is missing, though, is the thing modern historians would most like to have, the text itself. The books don't survive, and because they don't survive, one of the most influential religious instruments in Roman public life can now only be seen indirectly through later references and through the decisions made after consultation. The traditional origin story here already feels kinda cinematic. Britannica does summarize the old account this way. The Cumaean Sibyl offered a collection of prophetic books to Tarquinius Superbus, Rome's last king. He refused the price, she burnt part of the collection, and he eventually bought the only remaining books for the original sum. Whether every detail of that story is historical is another matter, but the tradition itself mattered to the Romans because it placed the books at the beginning of Roman sacred history. Dionysius of Halicarnassus says that the Romans guarded no possession more carefully, sacred or profane, and that access was tightly restricted to the elite custodians. Now, that alone tells you how seriously the state took them. What makes the book such a real mystery, though, is the strange shape of the surviving evidence. Roman authors describe when the books were consulted, and sometimes what action followed, but they don't preserve the full wording of the oracles. That means the modern picture is incomplete by definition. We know they were bought out in moments of military danger, political unrest, plague, prodigies, and public anxiety, and Britannica describes them among the most authoritative religious texts in Rome, consulted in times of crisis or doubt. But in most cases, what survives is not the prophecy itself. What survives is the Roman response. The center of the archive is missing, and only the effect remains. Now, those effects could be dramatic. The books were not just read and admired, they could change Rome's religious landscape. Britannica does note that the Sibylline books prescribe the importation of Apollo's cult at Rome, and the British Museum highlights another famous case. During a plague in 293 BC, the Romans consulted the books and were told that the crisis would end only if Asclepius, the healing god, was brought from Epidaurus to Rome. The later sanctuary on the Tiber Island became part of the city's sacred geography, and that tells us something important. Even though the books are lost, they weren't marginal curiosities. They were part of the machinery by which Rome decided when and how to absorb foreign cults into Roman state religion. In other words, they helped shape what Rome became. Then the archive itself was broken. Dionysius records that the books kept in the temple of Jupiter Capitolonius were destroyed when the temple burned, and Britannica places that destruction in about 83 or 82 BCE. A replacement collection was then assembled from various sources, materials copied from elsewhere. Dionysius is especially revealing here because he says the new body of oracles was scraped together from different cities and that some interpolations had to be identified and removed. That means the Roman state itself faced a problem of authenticity. Even in antiquity, the official archive was no longer simply the original inherited set. It had become a reconstructed corpus, curated, filtered, and partially repaired after a catastrophe. So the mystery's basically doubled. Not only are the books lost now, but even the later Romans were already dealing with a partially lost and reconstructed version. Number 8. The fate of the Ninth Legion. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion is one of those Roman mysteries that survived because the basic outline is so simple and so unsatisfying. A famous legion certainly existed. It served Rome for generations. It's attested to in Britain. It's tied to York so strongly that the city's museums still preserve inscriptions and tombstones connected to it. And then, at some point in the 2nd century, it vanishes from the record without a clear ancient narrative explaining exactly how or where it ended. Now, it's that gap that's invited speculation for more than a century, but the real interest here lies in the evidence itself. This is not a legend about a ghost army. It's a documentation problem at the heart of Roman military history. What is secure, though, is the legion's presence in Roman Britain. York Museum Trust preserves a commemorative inscription from York connected to the Ninth Legion and a tombstone of Lucius Rufinus, a standard-bearer of the Ninth, showing how visibly the Legion was woven into the city's earlier identity. A history of York also states plainly that the Ninth founded York and that it was later replaced by the Sixth Legion. So the Ninth is not mysterious because it was obscure. It helped anchor Roman power in northern Britain, and it left stone evidence behind. It belonged to the frontier world of forts, roads, recruitment, and occupation. That solid archaeological footprint is exactly what makes its later disappearance feel so abrupt. For a long time, the most famous explanation was that the Legion was annihilated in Britain, perhaps somewhere north of York, in a disaster large enough to erase it. And that idea became famous because it's dramatic and easy to picture, a Roman legion marching into hostile country and never returning. But evidence turned out to be more complicated. Scholars found traces linked to the Ninth on the continent, especially in the Rhineland, which made the simple lost in Scotland story harder to maintain. The history of York, though, still reflects the complexity by noting traces of the legion appear in the Rhineland after its time at York. So the question stopped being whether the Legion disappeared, it clearly did. The question became when, where, and after what final movement. Some recent scholarship has tried to narrow the problem without pretending it's solved beyond doubt. In 2021, an article in Britannia, Nick Hodgson reviewed the evidence and concluded that no more than a detachment of the Legion went abroad, and only for roughly a period of about 105 to 120. He also concluded that there's no other evidence proving the Legion still existed after the early 120s. Now that's a major shift away from older, looser ideas that the whole Legion simply carried on elsewhere for much longer. It doesn't solve the mystery completely, but it does tighten the limits. The Ninth seems to have ended earlier than some earlier theories allowed. Hodgson goes on one step further and offers the most likely scenario, while still marking it as an argument rather than a certainty. Because war, heavy Roman losses, and an interruption of the building of Hadrian's Wall are directly attested in Britain around 122 or shortly after, he argues that the Legion was most likely defeated and disbanded in connection with those events. There's no surviving Roman historian who says in a plain sentence that the Ninth died here in this battle and on this date, but the current scholarly trend appears to point back towards Britain, not towards some neat later transfer followed by an unrelated end elsewhere. It's that which is what keeps the mystery alive. Roman military history often feels impressively documented. The legions are named, posted, stamped into tiles, and commemorated on tombstones, and tracked through inscriptions. The Ninth Legion followed that pattern for a long time, and then just stopped. What remains is a jagged edge in the record. York still remembers the Legion in stone. Scholars can debate the detachments, the dates, and the frontier wars, but the final moment of them is missing. No eagle recovered from a battlefield closes the case. No definitive ancient sentence has appeared. For a civilization that documented power so obsessively, the Ninth Legion is a reminder that even Rome could lose track of one of its own most famous instruments of conquest. Moving on to number 7, the secret of Roman concrete. Not every Roman mystery is about a lost army or a vanished book. Some are just built into the walls themselves. Roman concrete, it's one of the great technical riddles of the ancient world because the results have been visible for centuries. The Pantheon is still standing beneath the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, and ancient aqueducts remain usable for astonishing lengths of time. For generations, people could see that Roman concrete was unusually durable without being able to explain exactly why. The mystery was never whether the Romans used concrete, it was how they made it perform so well. Part of the answer was always known. MIT notes that Roman builders used pozzolanic material, especially volcanic ash from the area of Puzzoli. The ancient writers themselves described that ingredient as very important. And Britannica also points out that around 200 BCE, Central Italy developed a powerful construction technique based on crushed stone, lime, and sand, particularly pozzolana, which could set into a strong material and be molded into new forms. A major breakthrough, though, came in 2023 when MIT researchers argued that one important part of the answer lay in the bright white lime visible inside ancient Roman concrete. For a long time, those had been treated as signs of poor mixing or maybe low-quality production, and the MIT team reached a different conclusion. Their work suggested that the clasts were created through a hot mixing process involving quicklime, and that gave the material a self-healing capability. When tiny cracks formed, they could travel through these reactive lime clasts, and then water helped create a calcium-rich solution that recrystallized and filled the crack. In lab tests described by MIT, the hot mix samples healed and stopped water flow within 2 weeks, while the comparable samples made without quicklime didn't. Then in 2025, researchers studying a newly discovered Pompeii construction site recorded what they called the clearest evidence yet that Romans used hot mixing. The site itself preserved the raw materials, piles, tools, and walls in different stages of construction, and according to the researchers, they found intact quicklime fragments pre-mixed with other ingredients in a dry, raw material pile, supporting the hot mixing model and helping explain how reactive lime became trapped inside the concrete. Roman concrete was not a single batch mixed once and then copied forever. It was used across different centuries, environments, and projects. The report of MIT in 2025 explicitly notes that the Pompeii site was valuable because there had been questions about whether one earlier analyzed wall was representative of Roman concrete more broadly. So basically, in other words, researchers are still testing how widely a given recipe or process applies across the Roman world. The broad picture is much clearer now than it was a few years ago, but the fine-grained history of Roman concrete is still an active scientific investigation rather than a closed file. Number 6. Who owned the Villa of Papyri? The Villa of Papyri is one of the most spectacular private houses ever found from the Roman world, and that's exactly why its ownership matters. This wasn't an ordinary residence. It stood on the coast at Herculaneum. It contained more than 1,000 carbonized papyrus scrolls, and it produced the largest collection of sculpture ever recorded from a single classical building. Getty's reconstruction of the site and the Oxford Herculaneum project both emphasize how exceptional this villa was, while modern scholarship continues to treat it as one of the most important elite residents from Roman Italy. The villa was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, then rediscovered in 1750, and it's still only partly explored. Recent excavations have helped clarify its chronology, with the core of the villa now thought to date to around 40 BCE, and a seaside pavilion added around 20 AD. The same report stresses that the papyri gave the building its modern name, and a 2024 survey of Herculaneum papyri describes the library as the only one to survive from the Greco-Roman world. The leading candidate has been the same for a long time: Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesonius, Julius Caesar's father-in-law and the patron of the philosopher Philodemus of Gadara. Getty states that because of the many scrolls contained works by Philodemus, scholars do believe the villa originally belonged to Piso. The Oxford Herculaneum project does say it is widely believed that he owned it, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy calls the Piso family ownership theory the most popular conjecture. But that's really not the same as a certainty. Cambridge's overview of the villa states plainly that the identity of the owner, or owners, is uncertain, even while naming Piso as the most likely figure. The library points in one direction, yet books can travel, collections can be inherited, and villas can remain in families across the generations. Getty's 2019 exhibition checklist even highlights a later family member, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesonius Pontifex, who likely inherited the villa and may have expanded parts of it. That really means the mystery is not only who built it, but also whose house was it at the moment of destruction, and whose taste shaped the version we now see. If the house belonged to Piso the Elder, then the library becomes easier to read as the estate of a major Republican aristocrat linked to Philodemus and the world around Caesar. If it instead passed through several owners within the same family, then the villa becomes a longer story about inherited culture and changing forms of elite self-presentation. The statuary, the garden layout, and the philosophical texts, they are all still important, but the frame shifts. The villa stops being a single snapshot and starts looking like a layered estate whose identity evolved over the decades. And that's exactly why the ownership question has never been a trivial footnote. Number 5. What were Caligula's Nemi ships really for? The ships of Lake Nemi are one of the strangest combinations of Roman engineering and imperial theater ever uncovered. Two enormous vessels associated with the Emperor Caligula were recovered from the lake between 1929 and 31, and the museum at Nemi still records their dimensions at roughly 71 by 20 meters and 73 by 24 meters respectively. Britannica does also identify them as ships of Caligula's period, while the Archaeological Institute of America describes them as two huge vessels built during his short reign and anchored on Lake Nemi. The basic historical outline's not the mystery here. The mystery is why they were there and what, exactly, they were meant to do. The first major thing that makes the question difficult is the setting. Lake Nemi was not an open sea harbor or a major naval base. It was a volcanic crater southeast of Rome, and the shores of Lake Nemi were associated with the famous cult of Diana Nemorensis. Britannica identifies the grove of Diana Nemorensis on the shores of the lake as one of the goddess's most famous sanctuaries, which means the ship existed in a landscape that was already sacred before Caligula entered the picture. Well, that immediately pushes the interpretation in two directions at once. The ships can be seen as pleasure vessels, but they can also be read as objects placed within a ritualized and symbolically charged environment. Older summaries often called them pleasure ships. While there is evidence supporting that description, Britannica does use that label directly, while archaeology, though, describes them as a sailing ship and an oared galley built and anchored on the lake as a pleasure craft. Now, these descriptions do fit the scale of the vessels and the broader image of Caligula as an emperor who was drawn to display and extravagance, but even if pleasure craft is partly right, it still doesn't close the matter, because such ships make more obvious sense on the Bay of Naples or along the coast than on a comparatively small inland lake. And that's why the original function still feels unresolved. The ships no longer survive, of course. The museum at Nemi notes that they were destroyed by fire in 1944, but what remain are documentation, drawings and photographs, surviving fittings, and the interpretations built from the recovery record. Because the ships are gone, scholars can't re-examine the full structures in the way they can revisit a standing or buried wall. That's left room for several overlapping readings: imperial entertainment, ceremonial barges, floating banquet platforms, symbols of divine association, or combinations of all of those. The fact that the vessels were tied to a sacred lake linked to Diana is not proof of one ritual explanation, but it does make purely casual use harder to accept as the whole story. The archaeology proves the vessels were real and also proves they were massive, but the meaning of them has to be reconstructed from incomplete remains, a sacred setting, and a ruler whose image was already warped by hostile tradition. In symbolic terms, they may have staged Caligula inside a space already charged with religious prestige. The evidence supports both possibilities more comfortably than it supports a single, neat answer. Number 4. Was the Lupercal ever really found? Some Roman mysteries survive because the evidence disappeared. The Lupercal, though, is stranger because the mystery survives even though people have repeatedly tried to point to a specific place and say, "There it is." In Roman tradition, the Lupercal was the cave at the foot of the Palatine where Romulus and Remus were found with the she-wolf. Now, the site was tied to the Lupercalia, one of Rome's oldest and most controversial festivals, and modern scholarship still describes both the cave's location and the festival's route as debated. So in other words, it matters not just because of the myth, but because it sits at a point where early Roman religion, topography, and political memory all overlap. Ancient literary tradition places the cave in a fairly specific general zone. Digital Augustan Rome describes the Lupercal as a grotto at the base of the southwest Palatine near the Circus Maximus, and notes that, following literary sources, it can be located on the lower southwest Palatine between the Velabrum and the Circus Maximus. But the modern controversy burst into public view in 2007. Reuters reported that archaeologists working during restoration near the Palace of Augustus found an underground cavity about 16 meters below ground, decorated with seashells, colored marble mosaics, pumice stones, and a central white eagle. At the time, the officials said they were reasonably certain that this was the long-lost Lupercal. It's easy to see why the announcement captured the attention of everybody. The chamber was dramatic, underground, and positioned near the very hill most closely tied to Rome's foundational traditions. Visually and emotionally, it looked like the kind of discovery people always hope for in Rome, a legendary place suddenly becoming physical. But the identification was challenged almost immediately. Reuters also reported that Adriano La Regina, a former superintendent of archaeology for Rome, rejected the claim and argued that the chamber was not the Lupercal at all. He pointed to ancient descriptions that placed the sacred cave nearer the Temple of Victory, while the newly found chamber lay near the Temple of Apollo. The point here is not that one side was careless and the other was wise, it was that the archaeological find was real, but its identification was contested. A decorated underground cavity exists. The preservation is not in doubt. The question is whether the cavity was the Lupercal of Roman religious memory or a later ornamental structure. The British school at Rome's summary is useful precisely because it doesn't pretend the issue is settled. It describes the topography of the Lupercalia as one of the most controversial problems in Roman festival studies and explicitly calls for further investigation. That means the debate didn't end with the 2007 Discovery headline. It continued at the level of serious scholarship. Rome was a city that was constantly rebuilding itself, and later emperors often overlaid archaic sacred places with new monuments and new meanings. Augustus, in particular, tied his regime tightly to early Roman tradition and to the Palatine. That makes it entirely possible that the memory of the Lupercal was preserved, monumentalized, relocated in emphasis, or partly absorbed into a later architectural program. So the honest answer is no, the Lupercal has not been found in a way that closes the case for everyone. Something important was found under the Palatine in 2007, and that much is real, and whether the chamber is the Lupercal of Roman tradition is disputed. For a civilization that tied identity so strongly to place, that uncertainty is important. Rome may have preserved the story of its founding cave for centuries, celebrated festivals connected to it, and built empires in the name of its origins. Yet the exact sacred spot where that story was anchored in the landscape is still not beyond argument. Number 3. Why the Roman corvus vanished. One of the most interesting mysteries in Roman military history is not how Rome won with a certain invention, but why that invention seems to disappear almost as quickly as it arrived. The device was called the corvus, a hinged boarding bridge with a grappling spike at the end mounted on the bows of Roman warships during the First Punic War. Britannica describes it as a gangplank with a hook that let Roman Marines lock onto an enemy ship and turn a sea battle into something closer to land combat. Now this is important. Rome at that stage was still learning how to fight major naval wars against Carthage. The corvus helped solve that problem in the simplest Roman way possible. Instead of trying to outmaneuver experienced sailors at sea, it let Roman soldiers do what they already knew how to do, which was board, overwhelm, and seize. The results were dramatic enough to make this device famous. Britannica says the Roman fleet used this system at Mylae and achieved extraordinary success, destroying or capturing 44 ships and 10,000 people. This is why the corvus has kept such a firm place in Roman popular memory. It fits the large Roman story perfectly. Rome sees a weakness, borrows naval technology from others, and then adapts the battle to favor Roman discipline and infantry. Visually also, it's one of the most cinematic pieces of Roman warfare. A heavy wooden bridge crashing down from a prow, the spike biting into an enemy deck while armored soldiers rush across in hand-to-hand combat. In a civilization famous for roads, walls, and siege machines, the corvus is one of the clearest examples of Roman pragmatism. And then comes the mystery. As the Roman navy evolved, the gangplank and corvus disappeared as the Romans gained experience in sea warfare. Now that is one explanation, and it's the safest one because it comes from the broad pattern of Roman naval development. Once Roman crews no longer needed to turn every battle into infantry combat, a specialized boarding device may simply have become less necessary. But that still leaves a real question. If it had been so effective, why does it fade from the record so sharply? Why does a device associated with one of Rome's early naval breakthroughs not remain a permanent symbol of Roman sea power? Part of the challenge in understanding it is that the record itself is thinner than most people assume. The old dictionary entry preserved by Lacus Curtius notes that Polybius gave a detailed description of the machine because that Romans, being unused to sea warfare, needed to make sea fighting resemble fighting on land. Now that explanation is persuasive, but it also ties the device very closely to one moment in Roman development rather to a permanent system. Modern scholars have pushed the problem even further. A 2025 article in Demos argued that the corvus may have been a fiction or a major exaggeration in Polybius, while earlier scholarship challenged the idea that Roman naval success depended on the boarding bridge to the degree that Polybius suggests. So the mystery of the corvus is simply not, what was it? We know that much in broad outline. The mystery is, why such a striking machine enters Roman history with force and then slips away into uncertainty? Maybe it was really just a temporary answer to a temporary weakness. Perhaps it proved awkward once Roman crews became better sailors. Perhaps later naval conditions made ramming, maneuvering, and lighter ships more useful than a heavy boarding rig. What can be said with confidence, though, is narrower, and in some ways more interesting. Rome seems to have used an aggressive boarding system at the moment it first had to become a major naval power. That system helped make Roman victories possible. But the exact place of the corvus in long-term Roman warfare is blurred by lack of evidence, debated reconstructions, and the fact that one of the empire's most vivid war machines seems to have belonged only to a short chapter of Roman expansion. Number 2. What happened to the Colossus of Nero? At the center of imperial Rome once stood one of the largest bronze statues the city had ever seen, and today almost all of it is gone. The Colossus of Nero was, according to the old topographical dictionary, preserved at Lacus Curtius, a colossal bronze statue about 120 feet high, made by the Greek artist Zenodorus, and set up by Nero in the vestibule of the Domus Aurea. After Nero's death, it was transformed by Vespasian into a statue of the sun, later moved by Hadrian near the Colosseum to make room for the Temple of Venus in Roma, and still stood long enough to remain a landmark in late antiquity. Britannica's account of Rome adds another detail. Less than 70 years after the Golden House had begun, almost nothing remained of Nero's palace except his huge gilded statue. And that means the Colossus survived the destruction of Nero's wider imperial fantasy, and it kept dominating the city even after the rest of his palace had been erased. The statue didn't vanish in Nero's own lifetime. It outlived him. It changed identity, changed location, and it kept accumulating layers of Roman meaning. Records indicate that Vespasian altered it into a solar image, and that Commodus even briefly turned it into himself as Hercules before it was restored again as the sun. So the Colossus was not just a statue, it was like a piece of political metalwork that was continuously rewritten by the emperors. It did begin as Nero's self-display, and then it became a solar monument. Then it stood beside the Flavian amphitheater so prominently that later tradition linked the name Colosseum to the nearby Colossus rather than to the amphitheater itself. And yet the end of the statue is still uncertain. Britannica says the huge gilded statue was later destroyed by one of the early popes. The older topographical entry preserved is less direct. It says the spring festival mention of the statue is the last in antiquity, and adds that the famous medieval saying about the Colossus should refer to the statue, which had no doubt fallen long before, while also noting that the name was transferred to the amphitheater only much later. The other, though, points to a monument that likely fell before the Middle Ages, fully repurposed its memory. This difference is exactly the mystery. We know the statue existed, we know where it stood, we know it was altered and moved, but we don't have the kind of clean, final record that says exactly when and by whom it disappeared. It was one of the biggest bronze monuments in Rome. It stood in the symbolic heart of the imperial space beside the zone where Nero's private palace had been overwritten by public architecture. It should, in theory, be easier to track than an ordinary statue or a reused fragment. Rome did that repeatedly to old objects, so the likely explanations are practical as much as dramatic. The statue just may have been dismantled in late antiquity, damaged by an earthquake and then scavenged, or deliberately removed as pagan imagery lost its protection. The problem is basically this, that may have is as far as the evidence securely goes. Even a monument on this scale could be rebranded, moved, partially remembered, and finally lost in a city that was constantly tearing down and rebuilding its own past. The foundations and literary notices tell us well enough that the Colossus was real and dominant. They don't tell us enough to watch its final destruction with any certainty. For centuries, Romans and later medieval observers lived in the shadow of that enormous figure. Then the metal body disappeared, the memory blurred, and the only traces of pedestal, text, and place were left behind. Rome kept the name. The giant itself was lost. Number 1. Where did the temple treasures taken to Rome disappear to? One of the greatest unsolved mysteries connected to Rome is the fate of the sacred treasures taken from Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Roman part of the story is not uncertain. Smart History notes that the Arch of Titus shows Romans carrying off the spoils of Jerusalem, including the menorah, sacred trumpets, and the showbread table. Britannica likewise states that the menorah disappeared after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and that it was displayed during the Roman triumphal procession, while Cambridge's summary of the Temple of Peace says that Vespasian's complex housed the spoils from the Great Temple of Jerusalem. So the first half of the mystery is solidly grounded in Roman evidence. The empire conquered Jerusalem, displayed the temple objects as trophies, and made them part of Rome's own monumental landscape. That makes the second half much more frustrating, because after being made so public, the treasures then become hard to follow. The objects were paraded through the capital and fixed into imperial memory. The menorah in particular became one of the most recognizable spoils of all Roman art, precisely because it was carved on the Arch of Titus in such a striking form. Yet later history scatters the trail. The temple treasures were kept in Rome, likely in the Temple of Peace, but the later fate of those objects is not preserved in one clean chain of evidence. That shift from full visibility to fragmentary tracking is what makes the mystery feel so Roman. A superpower displays the loot of a conquered sacred center before the world, and then history loses hold of the objects anyway. The most important late account comes from Procopius. In the text preserved at Lacus Curtius, he says that among the Roman treasures taken by the Vandals were the treasures of the Jews that Titus had brought to Rome after the capture of Jerusalem. Now that gives one major line of transmission: Rome to Carthage after the Vandal sack of 455. A later summary from biblical archaeology explains that the next stage of that same tradition, after Belisarius defeated the Vandals in 533, the Jewish treasures were displayed in Constantinople, and Procopius also reports that Justinian sent them on to Jerusalem because they were thought to bring misfortune to any city that housed them. Now that almost sounds like the ending of the story, but the problem is that it still doesn't produce a recoverable object at the end of the chain. Even if the tradition is accepted, the final physical fate is still unclear. Some later traditions insisted that the treasures were never truly leaving Rome. Others placed them in Jerusalem again. Still others assumed they were melted down, destroyed in later wars, or vanished during the Persian sack of Jerusalem in 614. The key point is none of these endings can be verified with the confidence the Roman beginning can. The Roman phase is visible in art, text, and architecture. The final phase is not. The strongest historical thread is that the treasures left Jerusalem, entered Rome's triumphal and architectural system, and then were carried off again in the violence of late antiquity. Beyond that, certainty drops sharply. The spoils of Jerusalem were displayed as proof that Rome had crushed a revolt and absorbed a sacred center into its own world order. It was carved into stone, housed in one of the capital's major monument complexes, and remembered in later writing. And yet these objects themselves slipped away. The menorah on the Arch of Titus is still visible in Rome. The actual menorah is not. Few Roman mysteries show the empire so clearly at its height, and then show the record failing us just as completely. Rome wanted these treasures to announce permanence. History turned them into one of antiquity's great disappearances.